If we get in a situation now where bald eagles are disappearing, there's a lot worse things going on in the world, just because they can adapt a lot of different situations. And if they're not adapting, there's some major problems. It's hard for me to imagine going anywhere without being able to find or see an eagle. And just like a few minutes ago when two flew by, and just about always an eagle shows up. I tell people when I give talks, I say, if you want to see an eagle, just look up, because there's probably one watching you right now, because you can hardly go out into Oregon anywhere without being eagle territory. The eagles are just a symbol of what the world could be like if we put our efforts into protecting the habitat and the wildlife. When I was in college, I went to college at a school in northern Michigan, and I had never seen a bald eagle. At that time, in the early to mid-70s, they were a lot more rare in the lower 48 states than they had been for a long time. And so I had never seen an eagle until a canoe trip with a friend. And we went to the Sylvania Wilderness area in northern Wisconsin, and I saw my first eagle. And from that point on, I've been very fascinated by eagles. I was fortunate to be able to do a research project on them. I started out as a forester. I went to college in forestry, which gave me some background in forestry. I went on and got a master's degree studying a raptor, the peregrine falcon. And so I had experience and education studying raptors. And when I came out to Oregon, the combination of the two, the forestry degree and the raptor experience, enabled me to step right into eagle study, because forestry was one of the primary issues with eagle conservation. In the late 60s and 70s, bald eagles had reached a low point in their population. And an interesting thing about that is that in Oregon anyway, that's what I'm most familiar with, bald eagle populations had declined dramatically even as early as the 1930s. And that's documented in one of the first bird books, the first statewide bird books that was published. And then in the 60s, another author wrote an anecdotal story about bald eagles in Oregon, and he mentioned that it hadn't changed much since the 30s. Now, the interesting part about that is that DDT was used in the 40s and 50s and even up through the 70s in Oregon, and that's what people assume was the cause of the bald eagle decline. However, if you look at history, it was shooting, poisoning, and trapping for 150 years before DDT was used on the landscape that really reduced the population dramatically. Our project was started because of a logger and local resident in Astoria, Oregon. His name was Bob Zeke, known affectionately as Cupie. And he was a logger, but he loved eagles. And he kept track of the eagle nest trees around Astoria. And in the mid-70s, one of his favorite eagle nest trees was going to be logged. And it was one of the last ones in his area. And he knew that nationally the bald eagle was being considered to put on the threatened and endangered species list. And he complained to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they investigated, and sure enough, the logging operation would have been a violation of the Bald Eagle Protection Act. And in order to mitigate the potential loss of that nest, the company agreed to fund a project at OSU on bald eagles in the state, just to see what we had. And that was really the start of the project I worked on. Cupie Zeke was devastated by the decline, and he also was very anxious to try to save what he could. And so any nest trees he knew about, he drove spikes in the base of the tree and told the loggers, because a logger didn't want to run into a piece of metal when they're cutting a tree down. So he did his bit, he did his little bit in his local area to try to save the last of the big old bald eagle nest trees. I got involved with the Eagle Project because I was looking for work, and I was interested in eagles, fascinated by eagles, and I found an announcement for a 6-month job at OSU that was to finish up a 2-year study of bald eagles in Oregon. Once I got started working on that 6-month project, I just became more and more fascinated with it, and we provided all the agencies in the state with important information on nest locations. So I didn't know I was getting into a lifelong career. I got a 6-month job, and now, now that I'm done working on eagles, it went on for 40 years. The eagle sits at the top of the aquatic food chain, which is fish and waterfowl. And that food chain tends to concentrate chemicals that get in the water. And some of those chemicals are detrimental to wildlife. And as they get concentrated through the food chain to the top, they show up in eagles because they are, they've eaten the fish that ate the fish that ate the fish that ate the plant that had the chemical in it. And so they're kind of an important indicator of the health of the system. Bald eagles are usually described as opportunistic scavenger predator. And that means they'll take advantage of any food supply, and they'll catch it live or they'll eat it when it's already dead. Ben Franklin wanted to make the wild turkey the national bird, and other people didn't think that was fitting for our national symbol, and so the bald eagle was proposed because it's a North American endemic, meaning it doesn't live in other places, and it's a hunter. That's a good hunter and scavenger and good parents, so it embodied a lot of qualities that people liked in people. And so I think because of that, it was chosen as a national symbol. I don't think it was ever really declared a national bird. It's a national symbol. When we started the project on eagles in Oregon, no one had done that before. So we really didn't know what we were getting into. And it was at a point in the eagles' status where we didn't know if we'd be documenting a decline to disappearance, or if we'd be documenting an increase, or if they would stay the same. So as we got into the project, and the eagle population was low at that point. As we got into the project, every year we'd redo the survey and we'd find a few new pairs. So it was really a gradual increase, and it was fascinating because you never knew what you were going to find next. It's important to know that I didn't do all the work. I coordinated the project and did a lot of field work on my own, but it was really a cooperative effort between all the agencies that were involved with wildlife and resource management, which would include the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the Army Corps of Engineers, just about any agency that managed land or wildlife was involved, because bald eagle nests could show up anywhere, and because of their status as a threatened species and their protection by the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, it was important to know where the nests were because they were to be protected. The long-term cause of the decline of eagles, at least in Oregon, and I think it's true for all of the range of the bald eagle, was shooting and poisoning and trapping from the time that the Euro-Americans moved into this country. And we learned in our study that if one pair of an adult dies, then it takes at least 2 years for the remaining pair to find a new mate and to start producing young again. Consequently, if one of an adult is killed every other year, they basically quit producing young, and that has a devastating effect on the population. It causes a long-term decline if that happens over the area. Now, the population had declined prior to DDT. And then when DDT started being used and the DDT built up in the food chain, that also affected productivity. The eggshells were thin and would break, and there would be no young raised. So DDT, the whole DDT problem was kind of the icing on the cake. We'd already declined the population over the long term, and then suddenly there's a poison affecting their eggshells and their reproduction. In Oregon, we didn't have to do anything to add eagles to the population. They did that in some places. They brought eagles from Alaska to New York, for instance. But we didn't have to do any of that. The main thing that we did in Oregon was to keep people informed of where eagles were nesting and protect those nesting attempts so that they were successful, and protect eagles in general so they weren't being shot and could become adults and nest. And after a few years of that, it became obvious that the population was growing on its own. Nest searching started out with a bunch of lists of nest locations that were provided by the different agencies and people interested in eagles. And that information came in all kinds of formats, you know. And so we just started going through those locations and trying to see if there were still eagles in those places or not. It was kind of the groundwork for a citizen science project that we ended up developing through that. In the early part of the project, we banded young eagles. And as part of that, I ended up climbing about 80 nest trees. And the original idea was to band the nestlings and see where they ended up. But we learned that we could climb into the nests that had failed and try to find evidence of why the nesting attempt failed. And so we would go up to a nest where we knew they were nesting earlier, but there were no young, so we'd climb in there and dig around, and sometimes you'd find an egg buried in the nest cup, or you'd find broken eggshell, or you'd find nothing. And so sometimes we get evidence of why they might have failed, and sometimes not. Bald eagles have learned over the centuries to be wary of humans. And so we did not have bald eagles in Oregon attack us at nests. They would just move away as we went up to the nest, soar overhead, call. They were disturbed, but they did not attack. Now, there's a different story in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and I got to go there for a project. And those eagles nest on the ground or on ridges, or there's no trees, so they're on the ground. And they're very aggressive. And we would have to, two of us would have to walk to a nest, and one of us hold up a big stick or a board or whatever we could find and watch the eagle and hold it so he couldn't come in and hit the person that was working on the nest. Bob, my supervisor, had his hat taken off and dropped out in the ocean at one of those sites. So. The whole nest entry project involved a lot of things. And first you got to figure out how to climb the tree and get into the tree and the nest. And they are big trees, you know, they're some of the biggest trees on the landscape. Fortunately, we had a close friend who spent a lot of time studying spotted owls. So he knew how to climb trees, and especially big trees. And so he taught us climbing techniques, which were a combination of tree and rock climbing techniques to get up into the tree without hurting the tree. And then once you get into the tree, you had to know something about banding birds and the behavior of the eagles in the nest, because if you reach up over or look over the nest, you don't want their feet to get a hold of you. So the first thing to do is to get a hold of their feet. Once you got their feet, there's not really too much to worry about. I had one time where I got the feet and I was proud of that, but then the eagle grabbed my ear and wouldn't let it go. So that was kind of painful. But other than that, once you got their feet under control, and then you could get their wings corralled, then they weren't very hard to deal with. And at that point in time, what we would do is we had vet wrap with us. So we'd get their feet and we'd put vet wrap around it to hold their feet. And then we'd get their wings under control and wrap them with a soft cloth and put a hood on them so it'd be dark. And they just calm right down, and you could just lay them there on the nest. And if we were doing a project where we were taking blood, we'd put them in a bag and lower them to the ground. And the crew on the ground would take blood and do whatever measurements they wanted to do, and they'd actually do the banding too down there. And then we'd pull them back up the tree and undress them and let them go on the nest. So it was a very interesting process. Getting to eagle nest was often a challenge. We used a lot of different techniques, not just driving around. Like I said, we did usually about half the nests in the state we'd look at either by helicopter or fixed wing airplane. And that was a real challenge for me because I'm prone to motion sickness. And so in order to fly in a helicopter for 6 or 8 hours and not get sick, I had to figure out ways that I could survive that and do my work. And I had it figured out, I could do that. Other ways that we visited nest site was by canoe. I spent a lot of time in a canoe, especially in the lakes, in the Cascade Lakes in the mountains or reservoirs around the state. I skied into nests in the mountains to get a look before the roads were open. One time I even went out on a snowmobile with somebody to look at a nest. I didn't do that very often. And then there was a lot of driving and on all kinds of roads and some places where there weren't roads, just to get to a point where you could either see a nest from a distance so you weren't disturbing the eagles, or get to an access point where you could hike to a good viewpoint. Bald eagles like to nest in the biggest tree in the area that has some degree of seclusion from human activity, and it's big enough to hold their nest, and also maybe provides a view of the hunting area or the landscape surrounding the nest. And the kind of tree really depends on the place in the state where you're looking. Here on SAUVIE Island, big cottonwoods are important nest trees, as well as some of the big conifers. People usually see the nests in the cottonwoods because the leaves aren't out, and so the nests stand out this time of year. The eagles often have more than one nest at their site, and in this case, we've got 3 in 3 different trees, and the left nest has grass on it, so that's an indication that they didn't work on it this year. The grass grew up from last fall. It's been great recording here at SAUVIE Island, because SAUVIE Island is a really special place for eagles, and it's a great place for people to see eagles. The reason it's so good for bald eagles is that it has everything they need to survive. There's a lot of water for fishing, a lot of waterfowl for hunting. There's trees for nesting, and a lot of wildlife refuge, which keeps people from being a big problem to them, so they can always escape from humans if they need to. And Because of all those attributes, the island is both a really good wintering area for migrant eagles, and it's a great area for nesting eagles. Our basic process during field work was to find a nest. First thing you had to do was find a nest, and then you get into a position where you can see the eagles and or the nest without being part of the disturbance. So we tried to stay a half-mile away. This nest we just looked at along the Columbia River it looks nice and big, like it was used recently, but this year it hasn't been repaired. There's grass growing on the nest surface, and if they were working on the nest, they'd have covered that with sticks by now. Get into a position where you can watch the nest with a spotting scope or your binoculars, and you look for the eagle on the nest first thing. If there's an eagle on the nest in an incubating position, like a chicken sitting on a nest with just looking over the edge with their head showing, chances are they have eggs, and so they have to incubate those eggs for 35 days. They have to keep them warm for 35 days before they hatch. And so the struggle for the birds at that point in time is that they nest really early, and they take turns incubating. So the female will sit there for a while, and then the male will come in and take over. And so they have to do these incubation exchanges, and they have to find food on their own to keep themselves working or alive or functioning, and keep these eggs warm for 35 days before they hatch. And then once they hatch, they have to keep the small young warm until their feathers develop to the point where they can keep themselves warm, and that's usually 4 to 6 weeks. So it's a big commitment. It's a 2-month full-time project to get young started, and then once the young get bigger, the adults have to bring food in all the time to keep feeding them because they're growing fast. It's like if you had a child and they grew from a new baby into a teenager in 3 months. Bald eagles take 4 or 5 years to get their white head and tail, and that's when they're called adults. That's when they have a white head and tail. And during that 4 or 5 year period, they're just basically learning how to survive they're learning the landscape, and they're learning how to survive on the landscape. And they tend to come back to the area where they were hatched once they become adults. And if there is a nest site that has lost a bird, or there's an empty nest site, or there's room for a new nest site, they tend to set up their nesting territories in the local area where they were raised. Once they develop a nesting pair, then each year they try to nest each year. They can have 1 to 3 young or fail in their annual nesting attempt. And what we saw in Oregon over the 30 years was that the nesting averaged a little over 1 young per occupied pair per year. Eagles in the wild it's hard to know their age unless they're banded, but there have been banded bald eagles recovered that were over 30 years old. And then there's some records from zoos where bald eagles have lived to be 40 plus years. Different people react differently when they find a nest on their property. Some people think it's a hassle, and they want to do whatever they can to not encourage nesting on their property. Other people think it's the greatest thing in the world, and I would love to have one on my property, but some people don't. I can think of one instance where eagles built a nest right above a person's parking spot, and they didn't like having the eagle excrement and food scraps dropped under their car every day. But that was pretty easily remedied by parking somewhere else. So, Oregon is situated such that it has a lot of good qualities that bald eagles take advantage of, and its position on the globe. If you look at the globe, Oregon is halfway between the equator and the North Pole. And as a consequence, we have eagles from the north, where they don't have enough food in the winter, coming into Oregon in the winter. And we have eagles from the south coming north after their nesting season, because it gets really dry in the south after their early nesting season. They come north where there's food. So Oregon is situated kind of halfway between these two things. And so we've had eagles from as far as British Columbia show up in Oregon, and as far as Mexico show up in Oregon. And on the other side of the coin, the birds that are raised in Oregon we call resident, and we banded around 120 of those young out of nests. And those young showed up as far as British Columbia and Mexico. And so really, if you look at bald eagles, the boundaries don't mean anything. They go north or south as far as they want to go or need to go to get food. The thing about Oregon is we have fairly mild winters, and we have diverse habitats from sea level up to high elevations. And so they generally can find food somewhere in the state year-round. Primary food items for bald eagles in Oregon are, number one, fish, because they are based on aquatic systems, and fish are the main food within those systems. However, bald eagles will eat about anything, and a couple of the other food sources are waterfowl. When waterfowl concentrate, bald eagles will kill and eat waterfowl, and they'll also eat waterfowl that die of natural causes or are wounded by hunters. When ground squirrels emerge, and this is especially true in eastern Oregon, the bald eagles will feed on the ground squirrels, and people shoot a lot of ground squirrels, and when they do that, the eagles feed on the ground squirrels that were shot. The lead that remains in those squirrels can be a problem sometimes. Wintering bald eagles are all mixed in with our residents. So if you see a bald eagle, it's hard to know if it's a wintering bald eagle from somewhere else or it's a local who lives here, because we have so many now. An interesting thing about the wintering eagles, and if you go to eastern Oregon where the nest sites are scarce and there's a lot of bald eagles there, you kind of know that those are just passing through and they're from elsewhere. An interesting thing about wintering bald eagles is that if they find a consistent food supply at a location, they will come back year after year to that same wintering area. And if there's enough food for multiple eagles to congregate, they'll go to a place and roost together. So they call those areas communal roost sites. And that'll happen here too. There's communal roosts in the hills east or west of SAUVIE Island. Good places to find eagles year-round would be a place like SAUVIE Island here, because there are a lot of nesting eagles, and they also have wintering eagles here. In eastern Oregon, the Klamath Basin is a famous wintering area, at the south end of the Klamath Basin. But again, it has a large nesting population, so you can go on Klamath Lake just about any time of the year when it's ice-free and see bald eagles. Harney County, around Mount Here Refuge, and between the refuge and Burns, is a favorite place for migrant bald eagles to show up when the ground squirrels are out and the waterfowl are concentrated there. Timber management had a big effect or had the potential of having a big effect on bald eagles. And before they were listed, there was really very little effort to protect nest trees. Eagle electrocution is just kind of a constant and ongoing problem. We didn't do much with that, but the power companies had programs to modify power lines or poles that were a problem. And about the only thing that was effective was if you found a dead eagle below a pole, you notified the power company and they would come out and modify the pole so that didn't happen again. And that's still an ongoing thing. There have been some amazing rehabbers around the state that take in injured wildlife and try to nurse them back to health and release them into the wild again. Just about every part of the state has someone who does that kind of work. It's really something that it becomes a lifestyle. It's really not a simple thing to do. Education was very important, and the decline in shooting, poisoning, and trapping was very important. The banning of DDT was important. So all those things together really changed the landscape for eagles. All those threats were reduced all of a sudden. Eagles still face the same threats that they have in the past. They're just reduced considerably. And an additional threat that we see in Oregon now is that the population has grown to the point where there's a lot of competition between eagles for good nest sites. And now a lot of the people that rehabilitate eagles get eagles in that are wounded by other eagles. And so that has become kind of an important impact on the species. So the eagles are fighting over habitat, nest sites, food sources. The Eagle Project was very much a collective effort. I just was fortunate to be the coordinator, so I got to be the face of it. But it was a project that was funded by many different agencies and private individuals. People that collected information came from really all the different agencies, major agencies in the state, as well as volunteers from all walks of life, from just a neighbor that lived in a spot where they could see a nest to a retired doctor or anything you can think of have been involved. There's been hundreds of people involved with that study. There were some key people who got together, and I think this was about 1986. We had 4 people form the Oregon Eagle Foundation, and that became an avenue for citizens to get involved with the project. Early on it was kind of an academic agency-centered thing, but as the project went along, we got more and more citizens involved with providing funding or doing field work, and a lot of that was done through the Oregon Eagle Foundation. When we started the Bald Eagle Project, we really didn't know if we would be documenting the decline of eagles through time, or whether they might increase or stay, a steady number. So over the years from the 66 we found in 1978, the population gradually grew year after year after year. And in fact, over 30 years, it turned out to be doubling every 10 years. And so by the end of the study, we had over 550 nesting pairs in Oregon, which was remarkable. Nobody even could imagine we'd have that many nesting pairs. And the interesting thing was that by the time we had learned how they could use the landscape and expand the way they did, we estimated it could at least double again in the next 10 years, but our project stopped. So I don't know exactly what happened, but indications are that now we have over 1,000 nesting pairs of bald eagles in Oregon. And a similar increase in bald eagles occurred throughout a lot of the lower 48 states during that same time period. So it's really been a remarkable story. A lot of people put a lot of time and effort and money into giving the birds a chance to recover. However, they did it most themselves when we stopped killing them. I think that was the main thing, was the fact that habitat was not limiting. That became obvious, and it was the mortality of adult eagles that was really the driver of the decline. To me, eagles are a symbol of the wilderness and the wild that the world was, before we developed it. And I think maintaining eagles will maintain some of that through time and be something that hopefully our children and grandchildren can enjoy. The recovery of the bald eagle is a good example of what we can do for wildlife if we put our minds to it. The bald eagle, because of its status as a national bird and because of all the publicity surrounding the bird and people's liking the birds a lot, I think it got special treatment, and a lot more energy and effort went into protecting bald eagles because of their status. Bald eagles should do well in the future as long as we maintain isolated places for them to nest and food remains on the landscape. I mean, if we get in a situation now where bald eagles are disappearing, there's a lot worse things going on in the world. The major challenges for wildlife in Oregon, so I think drought and fire right now are probably the key natural factors affecting wildlife. What I want to do is write a book on the eagles of Oregon. I had the opportunity to study the bald eagle for 30 years and then just spent 10 years on golden eagles. And as a consequence, I have learned a lot about the state, and I learned a lot about the eagles in the state and a lot about the eagles. And I'd like to be able to put that in a story that is accessible to more than just the scientific community, but to the public as a whole.